So, got it. Okay. Well, look, folks, it's Pete Follett here from the International Water Centre, together with my colleagues Sarah Cochrane and Brian McIntosh. And together we've been working alongside DESI, helping them with outreach for the Queensland Water Modelling Network. And so that's what we're offering today. And we've had a series, what we call the Water Chats, and this is the second in our series. And look at the outset, before we go too far, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians. I'm here today at Nathan in a nice bushy setting from the Turrbal and Jagera people. And I'd like to also acknowledge the different places where you're calling in from today. I also want to acknowledge, this is a week in which International Women's Day is being celebrated. So to the many women within our sector and online today, thank you ladies for everything you do for us in our sector, and yeah, looking forward to good celebrations for you all this week. Look, today, as we move along, this pipeline, it's a sort of a term we've used within our little group to sort of explore the different roles that we have within the whole water management, water resources area. Last month, as Mal mentioned in the conversation before, we had Steph Hogan from the state agency, what I call for water, Regional Development Manufacturing Water, gave us a really interesting insight on how they as decision makers use different ways to sort of set the scene. And we heard about the Queensland Water Strategy, which was a nice way. And I think Mal referred in a bit of a chat we're having before about it's a nice segue for a group like themselves. And today it's an opportunity to look at another, what I call decision-making role. Like in next month, we're actually going to be talking with John Raffini, who's a sort of seasoned modeler. And then later in May, we're going to be talking with Lucy Redding, who's a researcher with a particular passion for groundwater. And together, all of these different roles are linked. And I think today, as we explore the Sunwater team and the efforts, we'll be keen, Mal, just to hear how this sort of links, or maybe just get a bit of a taste of where some of the linkages are to other sorts of roles, and how you also sort of utilize that diversity of expertise. But look, Mal from Sunwater, Mal's sort of the Chief Development Officer, which sounds a sort of very broad role, but been working in lots of infrastructure projects over his career. But in recent times at Sunwater sort of had this sort of role, and he's got in his team there in the room today. We've got Anthony Moore, we've got Lewis and Michael Hughes, Lewis Rodriguez, other colleagues who Mal works with. So we not only just get one person to chat with, get a few others to talk with. But look, Mal, I think and look, today Mal's going to talk us through the approach around some of the sort of planning and some of their big projects. So Mal, if I start up, and is there anything quick you want to say about yourself, Mal, before we jump into things?
No, I don't really particularly want to say anything about myself, but just reinforcing, I guess, for those that haven't, watched the webcast with Steph Hogan. It is it's a good segue in, and it kind of goes into the what, and today I guess we'll talk more about the how. So the Queensland water strategy, and also in that conversation the SWIP, or the Strategic Water Infrastructure Plan, was also touched upon, and certainly that's, I guess, the next chapter for us here in Queensland in terms of how we're thinking about water.
Okay, Mal, let me just get start sharing and get your presentation up. Oh, sorry, I thought I was all nicely organised. Oops. Stop sharing.
So what we thought we might just quickly do, we've got an infographic which, for those that aren't familiar with Sunwater, we might just kind of step through that, and then we'll just go back into kind of a more of a conversational piece. And if there's any of the graphics there that can help in the conversation, I'll just get Pete to pull those up. But Sunwater.
Sorry, are we right there now, folks? Sorry, I've been juggling.
Yep, no, we're on the right slide
Okay.
there. So Sunwater supplies around about 40% of the water used commercially in Queensland. So predominantly our customers are irrigators and miners, and also there is a small element of urban water. So we've got 19 dam assets. We've got 64 weirs, over 500 kilometres of channels, and nearly 2,000 kilometres of pipe work. So we operate 365 days a year, and predominantly Sunwater was an asset owner and operator, and we're moving the business into being more known for being a water infrastructure company, which means that we are also an asset owner and operator, but we're also a developer and deliverer of water assets. So that just provides, I guess, who we are, and we'll move into the conversation now, Pete, if you like.
Next one. Okay. Why is my sorry? I'm just having a little glitch here with my. Why is that not wanting to? Oh, here. Sorry. Yep. There you go. So what do we got here, Mal? What's this picture of?
So this is a picture of our most recent asset that we have delivered, which is the Rookwood Weir. So the Rookwood Weir is now completed and moving through wet commissioning to make water available for sale. So Rookwood Weir is on the Fitzroy, and we were talking earlier on that Fitzroy is the second largest catchment on the eastern seaboard. So as we move into being more a water infrastructure leader, we will be developing and delivering more of these assets that will deliver water for prosperity. But what sits behind, and that's what we'll talk about today, is that is the end result of the process that we'll talk about today, which is how do we go from a group of candidate projects into a project that might find its way into delivery.
Fantastic.
So there's lots that kind of sits behind the planning and delivery of projects, and one of the things that we need to do is we need to get the balance right on a range of issues, and we also need to think that these are long life assets. So the assets that we are developing and delivering, and the ones that we own and operate, are all assets that have got an asset life of in excess of 100 years or more.
Wow.
So what we need to do is ensure that we're providing that we've got a robust process that we go through in the first place that considers the elements of the project and the impact that the project might have, and one that might produce the best outcome for the communities in which they're being delivered, and in the same light deliver the service need. So ultimately, I guess our process is around exploring what is the economic value that these assets can deliver. And I guess how we do that is in the first instance going through a blueprinting process, and on the screen you'll see some representations of our thinking around what might be areas of development and what might be driving those developments. So that could range servicing renewables demand, from could also be thinking about minerals and mining, and also agriculture and the various commodities that are associated with those commodities, and how we can actually meet the future demand that will occur.
So now this would be the current, this is a bit of a current snapshot of the areas of focus. Like there's plenty there of all those circles and what have you.
Yeah, so you can see, I guess our area of operation, is quite broad. So we've got Mareeba up in the north.
Yeah.
And we've just completed a project up in Mareeba, which is probably a good example, again, of where we actually did a modernisation of an irrigation scheme, which is now released around 11 or 12,000 megalitres of water for sale and for beneficial use that would not have been available otherwise. So essentially that project was about removing transportation losses that were in the system, and that's I guess an example of a project that was conceived and was worked through in terms of some options assessment, a detailed business case, and then moved into execution. So out to the west, you'll see one of our assets, which is Julius Dam. And so it is, how can we, optimize that asset? And, recently there's been some announcements around a transmission line called Copper String going out into that northwest mineral province. And, it's been, reported that, there is significant value, $60 or $70 billion plus of value that is sitting out in that mineral province. And like all good things, you need water. So water is the elixir of life, and that could be not only in human life, but it can also significantly contribute to economic outcomes. And then I guess moving down the page, there's developments around, so Bundaberg is a food bowl, one of the food bowls of Australia, and what we're seeing in that particular region is there's a rotation out of sugarcane into more high value crops. So crops such as macadamias and avocados and the like. So that probably just gives people kind of a little bit of a taste of I guess from a blueprint perspective, if we're looking at the state, what we're kind of thinking about. And then I guess what we do is we then, I guess if you skip forward a couple of slides where essentially we end up with a pipeline, and if you look to the far left, there's a number of candidate projects that will feed a long list. We'll then go through and try and understand how that fits into the regional water assessment, which is one of the things that her team spoke about in the last session, and refine that down into what are some credible options, and what do we actually need to move forward with. And you'll see that as we narrow that down, we start and talk about adaptive pathways, and then that will move into a selected set of projects where we can then start and apply, and indeed, I guess through that whole process, what we do apply is what's called the PAF, which is the project assessment frame that the Queensland government has in place. So that then leads us into a process of, once we've gone through an options assessment and shortlisted, moving into a detailed business case, which is goes through and looks at a whole range of issues that starts obviously with a service need, strategic alignment. Is this within the public interest? Sustainability, social impacts, moving through to a demand analysis, economic analysis, and financial analysis, and how that then might move its way into delivery. So it then starts to talk about the deliverability of the project.
Mal, just to pause for us, just to jump in, if I may. So along the way, you've obviously got various sort of interest groups who are obviously advocating for some of these projects as well, and you've got that healthy tension, I suppose, between what are some of the risks, whether it's climate change, what are the ecological and cultural values. So you've got this ongoing balancing act, I suspect you've got in looking at different parts. Like, I suspect that in your pipeline here, that must be all sort of sitting in different parts along the way in terms of how you use that to sieve the sort of the whole viability and plausibility of these projects.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Pete, and again, Steph Hogan touched upon some of the dimensions. So that could range from what are the cultural aspects that we need to consider, what are the climate change, and there's also industry groups. There is also a number of other interest groups or stakeholders that are consulted through this whole process. So if I think about the regional water assessment process, there is reference groups or consultation groups where people come together. And one of the things that Steph also spoke about was once you end up with all of those people in the room, you actually end up co-design happening, and you also end up with people understanding the context or the service need, and some of the decision making around why you might start, and so why you end up start with a list of maybe 20 options, and generally we filtered down into 3 or 4 options that are worth considering moving forward. So it is important that everyone comes along for the journey, because we don't know everything. There's also the science that sort of sits there, and for us to kind of stress test some of those concepts.
So what sort of factors would you use to do the stress testing a little bit? Like, I think it's a topical word of late we've been hearing, stress test. What's a stress test mean for Sunwater?
Well, I think it's kind of understanding the scenario, I guess the various scenarios. So I guess like, I'm not an expert, and but if you think about climate change, one of the things that we do know is that we just are going to, moving forward, we are going to be alternating between drought and flood. And so with that concept, so what is the frequency of that, and and what is the intensity of those two events. And so what does that then mean for us in terms of water resource, planning? So if we're thinking about that in the context, of our dams, we're thinking about, well, what does that mean for yield? So how much water do we have, for sale?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we spoke about, Pete, was that, water, water is a finite resource. So, in Queensland, there's, the resource operating plans, ROPS and ROLs. So, within any one particular watershed, we're dealing with that finite resource. And what we're actually trying to do is so how can we put that to the best economic use? In the private sector, you might talk about the bankability of projects, and bankability project is intrinsically linked to the financial outcome. Water is, as we've spoken about earlier, is a long-term resource, and it requires long-term thinking. And we need to, I guess, change, some of the literacy around, how water is thought of. And so when you're thinking about a concept of bankability of a water project, it is not just anchored to, financial. It is anchored to some of those, stakeholders and their interests that we spoke about earlier. So, what's the bankability of this from a cultural, social, economic, point of view? And invariably, water requires an investment ahead of time. I can't think of, I guess, a water project where people have actually regretted a water project. There might be some regrets around, how that, some of the planning and thinking that kind of, went into it. But generally, people are, putting the resource to good use. So, so how we think about that in a water project is important, and it requires, lots of, long-term thinking. So I guess the scenario testing, the stress testing, as I said, around a dam project, we could probably have, thoughts around, maybe 6 different climate change models in what that might mean in relation to the hydrology of that asset.
So, because I suppose that the Bundaberg example you gave is an interesting one of an area where, traditionally been sugarcane for many years, but obviously there's a slow but steady, or maybe it might be more than slow, but there's a change happening with the sector there to more high value crops or so. And does that mean you either, in terms of your planning, try to accommodate the existing waters, does that become then an operational issue in the way it changes, or in terms of, I suppose, what the consequences as that whole demographic of users kicks in there in Bundaberg? What does that mean then for how you have to plan, or is it more of a delivery thing in the sense the water's either there, is that unraveled at the moment?
Look, I mean, another good question in that, and I might kind of go to Mareeba.
Okay.
So when the Mareeba scheme was developed, predominantly the crop was tobacco.
Yeah.
So, society has moved. Tobacco's no longer one of those things, commodities that's in demand. So that scheme then moved away from obviously tobacco, which had a particular water demand, and the infrastructure was the scheme was, I guess, designed around that. To now, it is mangoes, avocados, bananas, and those sorts of crops. If I think about Fairburn Dam, so Fairburn Dam was built in 1972, and up around Emerald, and if you kind of last year we celebrated, last year, the year before, actually, we celebrated 50 years of that asset. So that then, I guess, also just demonstrates that these are long life assets. But so the population of Emerald, I guess in 1972 was circa 3,000 people. Now it's 13,000 people. Right. If you think about the mix of crops in 1972 to what it looks like in 2024, it is now cotton, citrus, other kind of higher value crops. So as we move through, so climate change will also have an impact on selection of crops, and also the yield that is available for those schemes.
Now, just a quick question. See, Brian wanted to throw something into the mix.
Sorry, working with multiple screens and my cursor went off. So two questions, one a bit more conceptual than the other. I'll ask a question that might be at risk of being a bit technical, but I'll ask it anyway. The conceptual question is about adaptivity. We hear a lot across the water sector, from bulk water supply to utilities, about maintaining, I guess, planning for adaptivity, adaptive planning, adaptive management. I'm wondering what that looks like for Sunwater, particularly as you're going through this prioritization process and then business case beyond that. What are you trying to remain or retain some adaptive capacity towards, and how do you capture that in some kind of maybe a quantitative way, but how do you formally capture it and incorporate it into planning and decision-making processes?
Yeah, I might invite Lewis just to maybe chime in on that, but to drill down a little bit more detail, but in a broader sense, adaptive planning is, for me at least, is how can we, build our infrastructure so there is, some flexibility within that, that either caters for, climate change and, or, maybe, change of use, but it's also, thinking about, okay, we developed this asset, based on a particular scenario, and so how are we, in terms of benefit realisation, how are we tracking against that, and is it delivering, what it needs to, and does it have the ability, to, accommodate change. So I guess from a high level, that's kind of where my thinking is. Lewis might have an example of where we have moved through that in the blueprinting and master planning process.
Yeah, we have, and to add to that, so what in particular regions, what we tend to do is develop a lot of different scenarios that might represent the variability in the future, and we can even run Monte Carlo simulations across that to give us a little bit more variability of that uncertainty, and then we come up with different options to meet those different scenarios. And that gives us that adaptability. So then, and so in the solutions that we develop, we also want to be able to know, okay, how can this particular solution be augmented in the future if one of these scenarios, high growth scenarios, comes through, and also making sure that we do allow for some growth in the demand, so that we ensure that we don't overinvest or underinvest in any of those solutions and development. So that's at a high level. That's kind of the level of detail and nuance that we go into in some of these areas.
Yeah,
So some examples.
That's great.
Some examples of that might be your choice of whether we end up delivering water via a channel system or a pipe system, and is the pipe system capable of duplication, and did we allow for that? Or if we're doing an engineering upgrade, are we picking a solution that prevents us from doing further work and further raising, or are we planning for the fact that what we do today won't limit the ability to do further expansion down the track? So they're things that we're constantly thinking of in how we go about today's work, to make sure that we've sort of had part of our thinking for tomorrow. And in some of our studies at the moment, we're looking at trying to expand capacity, and we're going back and looking at the work that was done 30 years ago in a pump station, and being very grateful for the fact that there's 2 pumps in there now, but there's provision for a third, and they built it with that in mind, and we want to continue that thinking.
That's a good example. So just making sure we're not sterilising, assets or opportunities. Now, was that you also had another question as well?
Oh,
Yeah,
Brian's always got questions. There's no shortage of questions.
I might park the other one just now and come back to it later.
Okay.
Well, there's actually another question. Rob Coco from Mackay is online. Hey, Rob, if you want to come up and say hello, Rob. Rob's sort of working in sort of one of the regional development organisations in the area, and was, I suppose, just curious around the adaptability around some of the water sort of supply demands in his part of the world, like whether it's a bit more operational. But I suppose, Rob, did you want to come on and just explore? You had 2 questions there, but I think this tension between some existing allocations and new ones, that how you work through that. Is that the challenge, Rob, that you were trying to flag?
Yeah, so it's probably, I hope everyone can hear me. So it's probably really a question of, obviously, we see from a regional development perspective, effectively every proponent under the sun that's effectively wanting some form of water storage investment and development, which ultimately has to go through, various pre-fees, fees and other business case development and what have you. So at the moment, we've seen processes where federal government's directly funded some of those, state governments funded some of those. So my first question would be, is there an opportunity to ultimately reach an outcome where, instead of spending what can be large sums of money on multiple fees, pre-fees and all the other bits and pieces, if we can somehow get some form of consolidation and agreement on where the focus would be. The other one would be, particularly through the region where I'm currently working, we regularly see year on year, probably in the industrial sector, less than 50% use of existing allocation that they may have. And within the agricultural sector here, in some years, allocation, for instance, within sugarcane might only use 10% of their available allocation, even though there's no shortfall of the allocation in the scheme or the system itself. So at the same time, we've got new commercial businesses and others who are new entrants requiring access to water, but effectively can't get that because the schemes are relatively full in terms of contracted or commercial allocation provisions. So we effectively see a little bit of water banking, for want of a better term. I don't know if that's an appropriate term, but that's in my mind how I sort of see it occurring. So I suppose my question really is, are there mechanisms and are there programs being looked at how we effectively have better utilisation of existing allocation, and in doing so actually create potentially new or additional industry and economic growth off of that, as opposed to always looking at new additional storages.
Okay.
All right. Good.
Is that okay, Mel? Like, this might be in some of the operational rules, which is a bit different from the development of new projects, but I think the concept's an interesting one. But look, leave it.
Right. I mean, I'd just point to the opportunity around water trading, that we certainly have done some work recently to try and promote water trading. There's probably more we could do, but those mechanisms do exist to help move water to where it's needed in any particular scheme. In terms of new water users, if a scheme's tapped out, I mean, any new infrastructure we develop, we'll always be looking at preserving the reliability of existing customers as well. So we're sort of stuck in a sense because the ownership of that water is actually sitting with those other entities in a very fundamental way. It's not, we don't necessarily own those allocations. So all we can do is help promote those opportunities to move water around the schemes to where they're needed.
Okay, so
yeah, I think in the point around so development of projects. So if I understood I guess the point, there are lots of proponents that wish to develop water projects, and I think if you kind of think about the two documents that Steph spoke about, that is going in some way to try and answer that question. So I guess what we're interested in at Sunwater is making sure that the right assets are built and the right planning goes around the development of those projects. So so Sunwater has got a rich and strong history in that space, and we have people that actually come to us and say we have got our water need. How can you help us solve that? So we'll look at how we what water is available. We'll look at how we can transport that water and get it to a particular destination.
Okay. No, like there's a range of different roles here, I suppose. And seeing, like, there was another question online about sort of monitoring and metering, which I think isn't maybe something you do in the development role, but it's more of an operational scheme system. But Michael, a lot of this must feed back into some of the water modelling that you do then, and looking at all the sort of feasibility and what ifs for these different projects. So is that where you got some confidence around the role of the trading work that's possible? Like, does that help?
Yes, I mean, our main point of interface really is around that yield hydrology modelling and supporting the team in understanding what the water availability in the first instance.
Yep.
And then understanding those risks around climate change. So we've in the past we've looked at it at a project by project basis, and we've worked with the team to sort of understand that variability in climate. Going forward, we're planning a piece of work to try and look across our whole portfolio of assets in one snapshot over the next couple of years, which will help identify potential vulnerabilities over existing assets. So rather than just sort of leading on a demand type of focus and then just looking at demand and then assessing vulnerability at each of those demand nodes, looking at it a little bit more holistically, and then trying to understand that vulnerability based on the latest information. In terms of water trading, we don't do a lot of hydrology modelling in terms of trading. It's
Sure.
really up to owners of those entitlements to do that. There are ways and means that we facilitate trading of water, and that's always something we're trying to encourage and improve. It's in a scheme such as the Pioneer, where it is historically underutilised, that would be our first port of call rather than investing into new assets. Is there a way to mobilise some of the underutilised water in those schemes? So it is something that we do consider as part of an options assessment at the early stages of a project.
Okay. Well, Rob, hopefully that helps Rob Coco a little bit. Like, I think there's different groups of different roles in these systems, but it does flag, I suppose, the value of water in some of these commercial settings. Like, it's yeah, that optimization, that access. It's an interesting contested space in a way. But Mal, like we've jumped in around. Like I've taken the slides off, but I think we most likely maximised the use there, which was good. Like, is there some other aspects that we spoke before the event? I think we've covered off on the main points. Like there was the interesting story about the Theodore scheme, but maybe you've touched on that on the other ones about, one of the very first scheme that was started. Did you wanted to elaborate on that a bit more?
Well, I mean, that's kind of sitting around, I guess, the Fairburn story, but Theodore, was the first irrigation scheme, that was, stood up, here in Queensland, and it kind of fits into that. I guess the messaging around, water infrastructure. You got to think, long term.
Yeah.
So, if you're thinking about developing, other various asset classes and the bankability of those, there's some immediacy. So generally, you would not, develop a project unless you had an offtake agreement. So if you think about renewables space, anyone that is developing a renewables project has got a power purchase agreement sitting there. So they've got an offtake agreement that's bankable. That is not always, the case, with water, infrastructure, especially in, I guess in that regional, setting. So, if we were, developing a project, a water project around a large population centre, for instance, maybe, a desalination plant, there is, there is demand there. There is the ability to get an offtake agreement, and with a greater level of certainty, move forward, with that, with that project. We don't always, have that luxury, and that's, I guess, when I was just introducing that, a different concept around, the literacy of the bankability of water projects, and understand that they're not just, purely, financial. They could be multi-dimensional.
Okay, but I suppose, like Lewis, I saw you've been involved in both some of the hydropower and hydrogen issues for Sunwater. Like so like the hydrogen's a very real discussion, but I suppose they're a new sort of topic of development in the last 10 years, I suppose, which is different from the past. Like is that the sort of bankability that you're referring to, Mal?
I think probably a hydrogen, I guess, just highlights the point. So if you think, when Burdekin was built, it was built, it had, coal, it had sugarcane, and some other commodities, and here we are in 2024 talking about, hydrogen. So in 1980, people were thinking, that the energy source was going to be carbon-based. But if you think 40 plus years on, and it goes to this, the question that we're, discussing earlier on, just about, adaptive planning. So, so whatever we're thinking about today, may not represent what is needed, in the future. So our thinking is constantly, in that environment.
Okay then. Brian, was there something you wanted to build on that? There you go. Question.
Yeah,
please.
Yeah. So I guess it sort of builds on the sort of theme of value and goes back a bit to the prioritization funnel. I think at the beginning mentioned one of the aims of Sunwater is to deliver value, and I got the sense that that's a mixture of different kinds of value. So economic value, perhaps environmental and social value. How do you go about capturing value and integrating that into investment planning and decision-making processes. And maybe a sort of a secondary question there is, how do you go about, I'll use the word optimizing the sort of combination of values? You know, that there'll be trade-offs between economic, environmental, and social, and there's probably some options that manage to maximize all of them, maybe not equally, but there is a kind of a technical term for that, Pareto optimization. But I'm wondering, how do you capture value, and then how do you go about trying to maximize it?
So I guess in terms of capturing value, there is a within the DBC process, there is I guess a number of things that we would look at and report on, to kind of understand, I guess, impact of the project that we're actually developing. So I don't know, maybe you've got some examples, Lewis, of I guess where we've gone through that, and then the considerations of optimizing.
Yeah. I mean, the framework goes to that benefit cost ratio sort of analysis, but that can be quite simplistic. And as Mal kind of mentioned, there's a lot of other considerations. So things like that wider economic benefits that a particular sort of asset will generate. So it's not just those direct, but it's those indirect benefits that come across, but also in terms of water security, water resilience to the existing customers. So it's that mixture of you're benefiting existing customers in the scheme by minimizing or increasing resilience, and you're capturing that benefit. Some of it's not as definitive or not as quantitative, but then you've got those wider economic benefits, and then you've got those when you put that lens of that broader macro future trends that might come across in the future. How can we set up a project that is able there to enable that future creation and generation, that 20, 30, 40 years ahead of us, which is what we've seen with Burdekin Falls and our other assets, that there's we know that there's resilience and future demand that might likely come in the future, and we're capturing those intangible sort of benefits as part of that study.
I think it is a lived challenge that we have, because when we look at our remit and water for prosperity, but that's about that broader economic benefit to irrigators, to agriculture, to industry, to urban development. There's a whole host of things that we're trying to balance. So finding that balance, and then you complicate that by regionally as well. So you might have economic development in one part of the state versus environmental benefit in another part of the state, and trying to balance that out in our planning. We are attempting to get better about looking at projects and opportunities through the different lenses, and seeing how we might balance up our portfolio of investments and projects that we're delivering to make sure that we are providing a balanced benefit against our remit in that space. So it does come down to understanding the impact and having that thinking applied in our project prioritization. It says, look, we've got limited funds, we've got limited resources. Where are the projects that we should be investing into?
Yeah, I think probably two other things that kind of spring to mind in terms of that the value capture. So so we might actually go and do get a cultural water study by way of example. So that will talk about the value of water to to the traditional landowners. And then if we are going to develop an asset, and how does that fit into like an Indigenous land use agreement? So what's the value that comes out of that? So other, I guess, elements might be job creation or regional development. So by developing a water asset or a piece of infrastructure, what does that then mean? So there's direct and indirect value that is created from a jobs perspective, from a social perspective, and the like. So I don't know. Does that sort of answer your question, Brian? Are we?
No.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Look, you've got a complex job, so I was really
No.
curious. There's not a single way to do this. It's great to hear. Thanks.
And Mal, like one of the questions, Joseph Tan from SQ Waters, like curious about what the sort of the time horizon for your planning ahead is. Like earlier on when you had that pipeline, I was sort of curious, like it's not as if whether you must do that in sort of phases of looking ahead into the future at different stages, throwing all the options. Like I don't know if that's a cycle you're going through every year, because otherwise that would get challenging. But is there a time horizon you're looking forward? And maybe by way of an example, maybe like when did the Rookwood Weir stuff start? Like if you went backwards in time, is that like it? But yeah, I think this time horizon. Let's stick with that concept.
Yeah. Look, I mean, Rookwood Weir, it goes back. I guess it's more, contemporary life probably started in 2006.
Okay.
But if you think about, so Sunwater came, out of, water resources. So it's probably fair to say that most, watersheds, waterways within Queensland have been, well and truly, pioneered, and there's been a lot of studies where water infrastructure has been identified, and that's probably the history of maybe water, globally in many respects, is that it does take a long time to identify and move through. How are we doing this? Is through the blueprinting and through the master plan.
Yeah.
So we've got lists of candidate projects. So we've got a database that sits there, and that as the operating environment changes. So by way of example, if you think about hydrogen, that would be an add into the blueprint and into the master plan, and we would then kind of look at the rest of the candidate projects and say, well, are they still valid? So we move through a process where we prioritise. So we've got P1, P2, P3, and P4 candidate projects, and as they move along the continuum, their status may never change, or their status may change, and their status may be moved up the pipeline, or maybe moved down the pipeline, because ultimately there's also some realities around how much I guess it's an affordability question, and again, funding of these assets is also could be considered to be finite. There's not an endless line of credit anywhere. So we need to adjust our thinking against, I guess, some of those metrics.
Like it's often been the controversial one in North Queensland, the famous Bradfield scheme thinking. Like I'm not sure if that's a project that's in your database, but it's had a long history of being the silver bullet solution, and yet it still pops up every now and then in all sorts of different guises as something that's going to solve things. But like I'm not trying to be mischievous here, but like it would be a challenge now and then when you get something like that it's got a bit of a it's sort of got a bit of a political background, I suppose. But it was a way of thinking of someone, but whether how real and feasible it was, but it's an interesting one that must sometimes raise its heads, or maybe as an aspect of it that maybe is possible, but in a more localized area rather than as a big interconnected shifting of water. But I don't know.
I no doubt that Bradfield was he was a wonderful engineer, and I guess the Bradfield report was delivered, and I guess the outcome of that report was more pointing towards smaller type infrastructure being developed closer to the demand. And if you think Bradfield's scheme, what was that, devised in the 40s, something like that. So we're 80 years down the track, and as I said, with the Mariva scheme, it was developed around tobacco. So Bradfield no doubt would have had something in his mind, but we've also had changes around the environment. We've now EPBC considerations, and interconnecting catchments and other things may not have necessarily been a consideration back then, but now it's something that we all of those environmental impacts that we need to think about, and how we're going to deal with those, or how we're going to offset any impact.
Folks, we're getting towards the end. Sarah's quite kindly just popped up a link in the chat. We'd love to have any feedback on the events as we're going along. Brian, you had, and so please, if you get a chance, that would be great to have. Brian, you had a question before around a bit more of a personal reflection. Is that a simple one you want to throw into the mix for the team here?
Yeah, look, you've all been in the water space for varying amounts of time, some maybe a little bit longer than others. Yes, I'd just like to ask you, given your careers, what sort of really surprised you in terms of how water planning, water supply planning has changed? And looking ahead, what makes you really excited? What are you looking forward to? What's coming over the horizon? Hope you're on mute, Pete.
And there's 4 candidates in the room, so we can get a few different views. So it doesn't have to be just you, Mal.
Yeah. Well, there's probably a couple of 100 years of experience sitting around this table. So
you're not that old, Mal, surely.
No, he is. I probably am the newest one to the water space. I've only been in water for about 3 years, and probably what attracts me the most is the potential. And you think about when you build a good piece of water infrastructure, how many lives will get changed for the next 100 years? How many businesses will thrive? How many families will benefit? And what does that do at a personal level? And what does that do at a state and national level? And I think water is one of those things that probably has the greatest potential to make that difference. And I think that's a great place to be.
Yeah, I was going to say something not quite as eloquent, but the opportunity to really build that regional economic value. I think water infrastructure is quite unique in that regard, and I think we're entering in a sort of a new phase. I feel like there's more willingness to invest in water infrastructure, and then provide that sort of regional benefit.
Where are you, Lewis?
Similar line of thinking, and it's water touches. a lot of different customer bases or different stakeholders. Like you've got the environment, you've got but you also got like urban customers, and you've got agricultural customers and industrials, and you know, without that water, you know, it's well, with that water there, you're just creating that regional wider economic growth and benefit that we talk about. And you know, and with things like hydrogen and critical minerals, that's the new sort of you know, tier 3 type sort of projects in the horizon, and it's quite exciting. But you know, we're not also forgetting, you know, the mum and dads and those, you know, farmers and families that really rely on that water. And when you go out to the regions, you really see, you know, materially how water affects everyone's lives. So it's similar sort of commentary.
Yeah. I mean, we started, so I think the question, Brian, is, you know, why are we inspired to be in water in some respects? And we started the conversation. So this is the week that we celebrate, you know, women. And so, you know, what a wonderful industry to be in, to celebrate, you know, the contribution of water, or how to make a difference in water. So if you think at one end of the spectrum, you know, there's a whole heap of initiatives around, you know, how we can help women in water, you know, women and children, and the difference that water makes in emerging economies to the lives of women and children, and how that then, you know, adds to economic, you know, benefit by virtue that we're releasing that potential, you know, into that economic environment. If you then, you know, take it towards, you know, the other concept of, you know, sustainable development goals. So SDG 6 and indeed SDG 5 is around, you know, gender equality. So again, you know, strong linkage with water. Yeah. In a more modern, you know, context, it is, you know, the concept of, you know, water is the elixir of life, and just everything that we do is touched by water. So if you think about, you know, from the time you got up this morning to now, you know, how many interactions that you've had with water. So it's an important resource, and you know, you know, I get inspired every day by the fact that I'm in the water industry, and you don't necessarily need to be an engineer to be in the water industry. You know, what we need to do, what we do in terms of developing and delivering projects is, you know, we, you know, we've got accountants that help us, we've got economists, we've got lawyers, yeah, we've got, you know, planners, we've got construction workers, we've got a whole myriad of people, and the joy that I get is that when you actually create a piece of infrastructure like Rookwood, you can then see, you know, how people, you know, farms and people's lives are, you know, being changed.
Look, folks, just conscious of time, but I think what you just touched on the end, interesting, Mal, because in terms of the skills and the disciplines involved, I think, and that's what we like underlying a lot of the discussion today, I think is a whole lot of different scenario work that's happening in the background. I think Michael and his team doing modeling, other people bringing in, looking at the biophysical and the social aspects. Like there's a whole mix of different discipline perspectives that come into this. But look, folks, conscious of time, and really appreciate Mal for committing to be involved, and for Lewis, Michael, and Anthony to join. Thanks very much. And look, folks, for everyone else online, look, thanks again for your interest. Look, if you have a moment to just give us some feedback on the survey that Sarah's put in, we'll definitely share a copy of the recording, put something up online as well. But thanks again for your interest in the water chat. We'll pause now of the recording, but if anyone wants to stay online to chat, I'm happy to stay for a little bit. But otherwise, if you need to head off, I'm sure you've got other commitments too. But thanks for being a part of it. So very much again. Thanks to the
Thank you.
Sunwater team. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, everyone.
Well, we'll have long. Okay. Thanks, Mal. I think that was good. And thanks,